Hey everyone, around here, HOAs don't win, Karens get humbled, and sweet revenge is always on the menu. Hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss how this one ends. David never expected that buying the house next to his own towing business would turn into a neighborhood war zone, but there he was at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, staring at a massive RV completely blocking his driveway like some kind of monument to entitlement, and behind the wheel sat Karen, his new neighbor, sipping coffee and reading a magazine, as if she owned the entire street. The RV was one of those oversized behemoths that looked like it belonged in a national park not crammed into a residential neighborhood, taking up half the block, and definitely not parked directly across his driveway entrance, making it impossible for him to get to work. David rubbed his eyes, hoping this was some kind of caffeine withdrawal hallucination, but nope. The 30-foot recreational vehicle was still there, in all its beige and brown glory, with Karen visible through the driver's window, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just turned his Tuesday morning into a logistical nightmare. He walked over to the driver's side and knocked on the window with what he hoped was a reasonable level of politeness. Karen rolled down the window with the slow, deliberate motion of someone who was already annoyed before the conversation even started, her perfectly styled blonde hair somehow immune to the morning humidity, and her oversized sunglasses perched on her nose despite the fact that the sun had barely risen. "Can I help you?" she asked in that tone that suggested she absolutely did not want to help him with anything ever. "Hi there," David said, forcing a smile. "I'm David. I live right here." He pointed to his house. "And I need to get to work. But your RV is blocking my driveway." He kept his voice level and polite, because he had learned from years of dealing with difficult customers that starting with aggression never solved anything. Karen glanced at his driveway, then back at him with a look that suggested she was processing information at the speed of dial-up internet. "Oh," she said finally. "Well, I'm just parked here temporarily while I figure out where to put this thing." She gestured vaguely at the RV as if it were a piece of furniture she was rearranging rather than a vehicle the size of a small apartment building. "Okay," David said, his patience already starting to fray around the edges. "But I really need to get to work, and I can't get my truck out with the RV there. Could you maybe move it for just a minute so I can back out?" Karen's expression shifted from mildly annoyed to genuinely offended, as if he had just asked her to donate a kidney. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising an octave. "This is a public street, and I have every right to park here." She emphasized the word right, like she was citing constitutional law. David blinked twice, processing what she had just said. "Ma'am, you're not just parked on the street, you're literally blocking my driveway. That's actually illegal." He pointed again at the obvious fact that her RV was positioned directly across his driveway entrance, making it impossible for any vehicle to enter or exit. "I don't think so," Karen said, with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in her entire life. "I looked it up online, and as long as I'm not blocking the street itself, I can park wherever I want." She crossed her arms and leaned back in the driver's seat, like she had just won a debate at Harvard Law School. David felt his eye twitch slightly. That's not how parking laws work. You can't block someone's driveway, even if you're technically on the street. He was trying to keep his voice calm, but he could feel his frustration building, like pressure in a steam kettle. "Well," Karen said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, "I'm sure you can figure something out. Maybe walk to work today." She rolled up the window and went back to reading her magazine as if the conversation had never happened. David stood there for a moment, staring at the RV and trying to process the fact that someone had just told him to walk to work because they couldn't be bothered to move their vehicle exactly 3 feet to the left. He owned a towing company, for crying out loud. He had appointments. He had customers. He had a business to run, and this woman was treating his driveway like her personal parking space. He knocked on the window again, this time with a little more force. Karen rolled it down with an exaggerated sigh that suggested he was the most inconvenient person on the planet. "What now?" she asked. "Look," David said, trying one more time to be reasonable. "I understand you need somewhere to park, but I really need to get to work. I have customers depending on me, and I can't just leave my truck trapped in the driveway. Could you please just move the RV for 2 minutes so I can back out?" Karen stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head slowly like she was explaining something to a particularly dense child. "I told you," she said, "this is a public street, and I have every right to park here. If you have a problem with that, then you can call the city." "The city?" David repeated incredulously. "Yes," Karen said smugly. "Call the city and file a complaint. I'm sure they'll tell you exactly what I just told you." She started to roll up the window again, but David held up his hand. "Wait," he said, "before you do that, Can I ask you something? Are you planning to live in this RV? Karen's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face. That's none of your business, she said, but her tone suggested that yes, that was exactly what she was planning to do. David nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Because if you are, then you should know that most residential neighborhoods have ordinances against using RVs as permanent housing. You might want to look into that before you get too comfortable. Karen's face flushed red, and for the first time since the conversation started, she looked genuinely angry. Are you threatening me? She demanded. No, David said calmly. I'm just giving you some friendly advice, neighbor to neighbor. He smiled politely and walked back toward his house, leaving Karen sputtering in the driver's seat of her oversized recreational vehicle. Back in his kitchen, David made another cup of coffee and considered his options. He could call the police, but that would probably take hours, and he had 3 towing calls scheduled before noon. He could try to squeeze his truck around the RV, but the street was too narrow, and he'd probably end up scraping paint off both vehicles. Or he could exercise the one advantage he had that Karen didn't know about yet. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for his own towing company. Hey Mike, he said, when his employee answered, it's David. I need you to tow an RV that's blocking my driveway. Boss, Mike said, sounding confused. Why are you calling the company? Can't you just handle it yourself? David grinned. Because I want this done by the book. Official paperwork, proper procedures, the whole 9 yards. And Mike, take it to the impound lot. The impound lot? Mike repeated. Boss, you know that's going to cost whoever owns it a fortune to get back, right? Yeah, David said, still grinning. I know exactly how much it's going to cost. 20 minutes later, David was sitting on his front porch with his coffee, watching Karen still planted in the driver's seat of her RV, reading her magazine, and probably feeling very pleased with herself for winning their little confrontation. She had no idea that a tow truck was currently making its way through the neighborhood with her name on it. The tow truck rounded the corner at exactly 7:15 a.m., and David had to admit that Mike had perfect timing. The big red truck with Thompson's Towing painted on the side pulled up behind the RV, and Mike hopped out with his clipboard and his no-nonsense attitude that had made him David's best driver for the past 5 years. Karen must have heard the truck because she looked up from her magazine and glanced in the rearview mirror. David watched her face change from mild curiosity to confusion to dawning horror as she realized what was happening. She rolled down her window and stuck her head out. Hey, she shouted at Mike. What are you doing? Mike looked up from his clipboard with the practiced patience of someone who had dealt with 1,000 angry vehicle owners. Ma'am, I'm here to tow this RV. It's blocking a residential driveway, which is a violation of city parking ordinances. Karen's voice went up about 3 octaves. You can't tow my RV. I'm sitting in it. Ma'am, Mike said calmly. If you're in the vehicle, then you have about 60 seconds to move it before I hook it up. After that, it's going to the impound lot whether you're in it or not. David had to hand it to Mike. The guy knew how to deliver bad news with professional courtesy. Karen's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red that reminded David of a fire engine. She turned off the RV and climbed down from the driver's seat, marching over to Mike like she was going to arrest him herself. This is harassment, she declared, pointing a trembling finger at Mike. I am parked on a public street, and I have every right to be here. Mike nodded politely and showed her his clipboard. Ma'am, according to City Ordinance 47-B, parking in a way that blocks access to a private driveway is illegal, regardless of whether you're on public or private property. The homeowner filed a complaint, and I'm authorized to remove the vehicle. Karen snatched the clipboard out of his hands and stared at it like it was written in hieroglyphics. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Absolutely ridiculous. Who filed this complaint? Mike pointed across the street to where David was sitting on his porch, still holding his coffee cup. That gentleman right there says you're blocking his driveway. Karen's head snapped around, and she locked eyes with David. For a moment they stared at each other across the street, like 2 gunfighters in an old Western movie. Then Karen marched across the street, with the clipboard clutched in her hand, and the kind of righteous fury that only comes from being absolutely convinced you're in the right. You, she said, pointing at David. You called a tow truck on me. David took a sip of his coffee and nodded. Yup. You can't do that, Karen shouted. I told you I have every right to park there. Actually, David said, setting down his coffee cup. You don't. And I told you that parking across someone's driveway is illegal. You chose not to listen. Karen waved the clipboard in the air like she was trying to flag down a rescue helicopter. This is entrapment. You're trying to steal my RV. David raised an eyebrow. I'm not stealing anything. I'm having an illegally parked vehicle towed. There's a difference. Where are they taking it? Karen demanded. The impound lot, David said matter-of-factly. Karen's face went pale. The impound lot? Do you have any idea how much it costs to get a vehicle out of impound? David nodded. Yeah, I do. It's about $300 for the tow, plus $50 a day for storage, plus administrative fees, so probably around $400 if you get it out today. Karen stared at him in horror. $400? Are you insane? I don't have $400. Well, David said, standing up and brushing off his pants. Maybe you should have thought of that before you decided to block my driveway. He started walking toward his truck, which Mike had thoughtfully positioned so David could back out once the RV was gone. Wait, Karen shouted, running after him. You can't just leave me here. David turned around. I'm not leaving you anywhere. You're free to go wherever you want. You just can't take your RV with you right now. Karen's voice cracked slightly. But I live in that RV. All my stuff is in there. David paused at that. You live in it? Like, permanently? Yes, Karen said, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely distressed, rather than just angry. I lost my apartment last month, and I've been staying in the RV while I figure out what to do next. David felt a tiny pang of sympathy, but then he remembered her attitude from earlier, and the fact that she'd basically told him to walk to work because she couldn't be bothered to move her vehicle. Look, he said, I'm sorry about your situation, but that doesn't give you the right to block other people's driveways. There are RV parks, there are campgrounds, there are legal places to park that thing. Those places cost money, Karen protested. So does getting your RV out of impound, David pointed out. Karen stared at him for a long moment, then turned back toward Mike, who was already positioning the tow truck to hook up the RV. Wait, she shouted. Please don't tow it. I'll move it right now. Mike looked over at David. Boss, what do you think? David was surprised. Boss? He repeated. Mike grinned. Oh, did I forget to mention? David owns Thompson's Towing. This is his truck. Karen's jaw dropped. She turned slowly back toward David, her face cycling through confusion, realization, and pure horror. You own the towing company? Yeah, David said. Thompson's Towing, that's me. Karen's voice came out as barely a whisper. So you're towing my RV to your own impound lot? Yep, David said cheerfully. And I have to say, the irony is not lost on me. Karen stood there for a moment, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Then she did something David didn't expect. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of bitter, defeated laugh that people make when they realize they've been outsmarted by the universe itself. Oh my God, she said, shaking her head. I picked a fight with the one person in the neighborhood who owns a towing company. I literally could not have made a worse choice. David had to admit he was impressed by her ability to recognize the cosmic joke of her situation. Look, he said, I don't actually want to ruin your day. If you move the RV right now and promise not to block my driveway again, I'll call off the tow. Karen looked at him suspiciously. Really? You'd do that? Yeah, David said, but only if you move it right now and find somewhere else to park it. And I mean somewhere legal, not just 3 feet down the street. Karen nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. I'll move it right now. Thank you so much. She ran back to the RV and climbed into the driver's seat. David watched as she started the engine and began the complicated process of maneuvering the oversized vehicle away from his driveway. It took about 10 minutes and involved a lot of backing up and pulling forward, but eventually she managed to get the RV pointed in the right direction and started driving down the street. David thought that was the end of it. He waved goodbye to Mike, backed his truck out of the driveway, and headed to work feeling pretty good about how he'd handled the situation. He'd been firm but fair, he'd solved the problem without completely destroying someone's life, and he'd managed to get to work only about an hour late. But of course, this was Karen he was dealing with, and Karen was apparently not done with him yet. That evening when David got home from work, he found a handwritten note taped to his front door. In flowery cursive handwriting, it read, Dear David, thank you so much for your kindness this morning. I found a lovely RV park just outside of town, and I'm getting settled in nicely. I wanted to apologize for being so difficult earlier. You were absolutely right, and I was completely wrong. I hope we can be good neighbors going forward. Sincerely, Karen. David smiled as he read the note. Maybe Karen had learned something from their encounter. Maybe she'd realized that being entitled and aggressive wasn't the best way to handle conflicts with neighbors. Maybe this whole thing had actually worked out for the best. And then he looked up and saw the RV parked directly across his driveway again. David stared at the RV for a full 30 seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. The handwritten apology note was still in his hand, the ink barely dry, and yet there was Karen's beige and brown behemoth sitting in exactly the same spot it had been that morning. It was like some kind of nightmare version of Groundhog Day. He walked over to the RV and knocked on the door. Karen answered almost immediately with a bright smile on her face, like she was greeting an old friend. "David," she said cheerfully. "I was just thinking about you. Did you get my note?" David held up the piece of paper. "Yeah, I got it, and I'm looking at your RV, which is once again blocking my driveway." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Oh, that. Well, I went to the RV park like I said I would, but it turns out they want $60 a night. Can you believe that? $60 just to park overnight. That's highway robbery." David felt his eyes start to twitch again. "So you decided to come back and block my driveway instead?" "Well," Karen said with a little laugh, "I figured since you were so understanding this morning, maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. You know, neighbor to neighbor." David took a deep breath. "Karen, what exactly are you proposing?" "Well," she said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, "I was thinking maybe I could park here at night and then move the RV during the day when you need to get out for work. That way I save money on the RV park, and you still get to use your driveway." David stared at her. "You want to use my driveway as a free RV park?" "Not your driveway," Karen said quickly. "The street in front of your driveway. Technically it's public property." "Karen," David said slowly, "we've been through this. Parking across someone's driveway is illegal whether it's day or night, and I already told you this morning that I didn't want you parking here." Karen's smile faltered slightly. "But you were so nice about it earlier. I thought maybe we had an understanding." "The understanding," David said, "was that you would move the RV and not park it here anymore. Not that you would move it temporarily and then bring it back." Karen's expression shifted from hopeful to defensive. "Look, I'm in a really difficult situation here. I can't afford $60 a night for an RV park, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I thought you of all people would understand." David rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "Karen, I do understand that you're in a tough spot, but that doesn't give you the right to block my driveway. There have to be other options." "Like what?" Karen demanded. "Do you know how expensive everything is these days? RV parks, apartments, even just renting a room somewhere. I'm barely scraping by as it is." David looked at her carefully. "What happened to your apartment?" Karen's face flushed slightly. "That's personal." "Okay," David said. "But if you're having financial problems, there are resources available, social services, non-profit organizations, even just asking family or friends for help." Karen's expression hardened. "I don't need charity. I just need a place to park my RV that doesn't cost a fortune." "Then find a different street," David said. "There are plenty of places in the city where you can park legally without blocking someone's driveway." "Those places aren't safe," Karen protested. "This is a nice neighborhood. I feel secure here." David was starting to understand the real issue. Karen didn't just need a place to park her RV. She had decided that his street, specifically the spot in front of his driveway, was where she wanted to live, and she was going to keep coming back until he gave up and let her stay. "Karen," he said, "I'm going to be very clear about this. You cannot park your RV here. Not tonight, not tomorrow night, not ever. If you park here again, I'm going to have it towed again, and this time, I'm not going to give you a chance to move it first." Karen's face went pale. "You wouldn't?" "I absolutely would," David said. "And just so we're clear, the impound fees go up every day, so if you park here tomorrow and I have it towed, you'll be looking at about $450 to get it back. The day after that, $500, and so on." Karen stared at him in disbelief. "You're threatening me." "I'm not threatening you," David said calmly. "I'm explaining the consequences of your actions. You have been told multiple times that parking here is illegal. You have been given multiple chances to find somewhere else to park. At this point, if you choose to park here again, you're doing it with full knowledge of what will happen." Karen's voice rose to a shout. "This is harassment. You're trying to force me out of the neighborhood." "No," David said. "I'm trying to force you to follow the law. There's a difference." Several neighbors had started to come outside to see what the commotion was about. David noticed Mrs. Patterson from across the street, peeking through her curtains, and the college students next door had opened their front door to listen. Great, he thought. Now the whole neighborhood is going to think I'm the bad guy. Karen must have noticed the audience too, because she suddenly switched tactics. Please, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'm just trying to find a safe place to sleep. I lost my home, and I have nowhere else to go. This man is trying to have my RV towed just because I'm parked on a public street. David felt his frustration spike. She was trying to make him look like the villain in front of the neighbors, painting herself as a victim of his heartless persecution. Karen, he said, you're not just parked on a public street, you're blocking my driveway, again. It's just for tonight, Karen said, her voice taking on a pleading tone that was clearly performed for the neighbors' benefit. I promise I'll move it first thing in the morning. David looked around at the faces watching from doorways and windows. He could see the calculation in Karen's eyes. She was betting that he wouldn't want to look like the neighborhood bully who kicked a homeless woman out onto the street. Karen, David said loudly enough for everyone to hear, you told me the exact same thing this morning. You said you would move the RV and find somewhere else to park. Instead, you came back and blocked my driveway again. How many times do you think I should believe that promise? Karen's face flushed. I tried to find somewhere else, but everywhere I looked was too expensive or too dangerous, or they didn't allow RVs. I'm doing the best I can. Then maybe, David said, you should have thought of that before you decided to live in an RV in a residential neighborhood that doesn't allow RV parking. The comment hit home. Karen's face went red, and she stepped closer to David with her fists clenched. You think this is funny? She hissed. You think it's amusing to watch someone struggle? No, David said. I think it's frustrating to have someone repeatedly break the law and then act like they're the victim when there are consequences. Karen turned toward the neighbors who were still watching. You see how he talks to me, she called out. This is what passes for Christian charity in this neighborhood. David felt his patience finally snap. Okay, he said, pulling out his phone. You know what? I'm done with this conversation. He dialed his company's after-hours number. Wait, Karen said, her voice suddenly uncertain. What are you doing? I'm calling for a tow truck, David said. You've had multiple warnings, multiple chances to move your RV, and multiple opportunities to find somewhere else to park. I'm not going to keep having this same conversation every day. Karen's eyes went wide. You can't. I just got here. Yeah, David said as the phone rang. That's exactly the problem. Mike answered on the second ring. Thompson's Towing, after-hours service. Mike, it's David. Remember that RV from this morning? It's back. The same one? Mike asked. Are you kidding me? Nope, David said, watching Karen's face grow paler by the second. Same RV, same spot, same owner. Can you come get it? On my way, boss. This is going to be expensive for whoever owns it. David hung up and looked at Karen. You have about 15 minutes before the tow truck gets here. I suggest you use that time to move your RV. Karen stared at him in disbelief. You're actually going to do this? Yes, David said. I am. But I apologized, Karen protested. I wrote you a note. And then you came back and blocked my driveway again, David pointed out. The apology doesn't really mean much when you keep doing the same thing. Karen looked around desperately at the neighbors who were still watching. Someone help me, she called out. This man is trying to steal my home. Mrs. Patterson stepped out of her house and walked across the street. She was a small elderly woman with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from raising 6 children and working as a school principal for 30 years. Excuse me, Mrs. Patterson said to Karen, but are you the one who's been parking that RV across David's driveway? Karen nodded eagerly. Yes, and he's trying to have it towed, just because I'm having financial problems. Mrs. Patterson looked at the RV, then at David's driveway, then back at Karen. Honey, she said in the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, you can't park across someone's driveway. That's not legal anywhere. Karen's face fell. But I have nowhere else to go. That's unfortunate, Mrs. Patterson said, but it doesn't change the law. David has every right to have your RV towed. Karen looked around at the other neighbors hoping for support, but she could see the same message in their faces. She had overplayed her hand by trying to make David look like the villain, and now everyone could see that she was simply in the wrong. The tow truck rounded the corner right on schedule, and Karen seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. Please, she said one last time. I'll move it right now if you just call off the tow truck. David looked at her for a long moment. Karen, you said the exact same thing this morning. You promised you would find somewhere else to park, and you came back anyway. Why should I believe you this time? Karen opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She knew he was right. She had broken her promise once already, and there was no reason to think she wouldn't do it again. Mike pulled up behind the RV and got out with his clipboard. "Evening, boss," he said to David. "Same customer as this morning?" "Same customer," David confirmed. "Same violation, same location." Mike shook his head. Some people never learn. He walked over to Karen, who was standing beside the RV, looking like she was about to cry. "Ma'am," Mike said politely, "I'm going to need you to remove any personal belongings you want to keep before I hook up the RV. Once it's at the impound lot, you won't be able to access it until you pay the fees." Karen stared at him in horror. "Personal belongings? But I live in there. Everything I own is in there." Mike looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can only give you about 10 minutes to grab essentials. Clothes, medications, important documents, that kind of thing." Karen looked back and forth between Mike and David, like she was hoping one of them would suddenly change their mind and tell her this was all a big joke. When neither of them spoke, she slowly climbed into the RV to gather her things. David watched her through the windows as she moved around inside the RV, stuffing items into a suitcase. He couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. Yes, she had been stubborn and entitled and had ignored multiple warnings, but she was also clearly in a difficult situation, and this was going to make things much worse for her. But then he remembered the way she had tried to manipulate the neighbors into thinking he was the bad guy, and the way she had completely dismissed his needs and his rights as a homeowner. Sympathy only went so far. Karen emerged from the RV, carrying a large suitcase and a small bag. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked David. "I can't afford a hotel, and I don't have any family in the area." David felt that pang of sympathy again. "There are shelters," he said. "Social services can help you find temporary housing." Karen shook her head. "I've tried the shelters. They're full, or they don't allow pets." She gestured toward the RV, where David could now see a small dog looking out the window. "You have a dog in there?" David asked. "His name is Buster," Karen said. "He's all I have left. I can't just abandon him." David looked at the dog, who was staring back at him with big brown eyes. This was getting complicated. He looked at Mike, who was waiting patiently for instructions. "Mike," David said, "give us another few minutes." Mike nodded and walked back to the tow truck. David turned to Karen, who was clutching her suitcase like it was a life preserver. "Look," he said, "I understand this is a difficult situation, but you can't just decide to live on my street because it's convenient for you. There are rules, there are laws, and there are other people's rights to consider." Karen wiped her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "I just didn't know what else to do." David thought for a moment. "The RV park you mentioned earlier, the one that costs $60 a night. How much do you have saved up?" Karen looked embarrassed. "About $40. $40 total?" David asked. Karen nodded. "I lost my job 3 months ago, and I've been living off my savings. The RV was supposed to be a temporary solution while I looked for work, but then I couldn't find anything that paid enough to afford rent." David sighed. This was exactly the kind of situation he had been trying to avoid. "What kind of work do you do?" "I was a receptionist at a dental office," Karen said. "But they laid me off when they switched to a new computer system. They said I was too old to learn the new software." David looked at her more carefully. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed despite her circumstances, and clearly trying to maintain some dignity in an impossible situation. "Have you looked for other receptionist jobs?" "Everywhere," Karen said. "But they all want someone younger, or they want experience with software I don't know how to use, or they don't pay enough to afford rent in this area." David found himself in an uncomfortable position. He was still angry about the way Karen had handled the situation, but he was also starting to understand that she wasn't just entitled and difficult. She was desperate and scared, and making bad decisions because she didn't know what else to do. "Okay," he said finally. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to have Mike take your RV to the impound lot, because you can't park it here, but I'm not going to charge you the full impound fees if you can get it out within the next 2 days." Karen looked up at him with hope in her eyes. "Really?" "Really," David said, "but only if you promise that you won't bring it back to this street. And I mean promise, not just say you will, and then change your mind later." Karen nodded eagerly. "I promise. I swear I won't park it here again." David looked at her for a long moment, trying to decide if he believed her. "Okay," he said. "Mike will take the RV to the lot. You have 2 days to come up with the money to get it out. If you can't, then you'll have to pay the full fees. Thank you, Karen said. Thank you so much. But where am I supposed to stay tonight? David looked around at the neighbors who were still watching. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. Honey, she said to Karen, I have a guest room you can use for a night or two, just until you figure out what to do next. Karen stared at her in surprise. Really? You'd do that for me? Of course, Mrs. Patterson said. We all need help sometimes. David watched as Mrs. Patterson led Karen across the street toward her house, the small dog tucked under Karen's arm. Mike finished hooking up the RV and gave David a thumbs up. Take it easy on the storage fees, boss, Mike said quietly. That lady's having a rough time. David nodded. Yeah, I know. Just take it to the lot and we'll figure out the rest later. As the tow truck pulled away with Karen's RV, David stood in his driveway and looked at the clear space where the massive vehicle had been parked. He could finally get his truck out in the morning without any trouble. The immediate problem was solved. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. Karen had made promises before and broken them. What was to stop her from doing it again once she got her RV back? He walked into his house and made himself a cup of coffee, trying to put the whole situation out of his mind. Tomorrow he would go to work, do his job, and hopefully not have to deal with any more RV-related drama. But somehow he doubted it would be that simple. The next morning, David woke up early and looked out his window, half expecting to see Karen's RV parked across his driveway again. But the street was empty, and he was able to back out of his driveway without any trouble. Maybe, he thought, Karen had actually learnt her lesson this time. He was wrong. Around lunchtime, David got a call from Mike. Boss, Mike said, you're not going to believe this. Remember that lady with the RV? She's here at the impound lot, and she's threatening to sue us. David sighed and rubbed his temples. Sue us for what? She's claiming we illegally towed her RV, Mike said. She says she was parked legally on a public street, and we had no right to take it. She's got some kind of printout from the internet that she keeps waving around. David felt his eyes start to twitch again. Did you explain to her that blocking a driveway is illegal? I tried, Mike said, but she's not listening. She keeps saying that technically she was parked on the street, not in the driveway, so the tow was illegal. She wants to talk to the owner. Well, David said, she's about to get her wish. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, David pulled into the parking lot of his impound facility to find Karen standing outside the office with a stack of papers in her hand, and the same righteous indignation on her face that he'd seen the night before. She was talking rapidly to Mike, who looked like he was trying very hard to maintain his professional demeanor. Karen, David said as he got out of his truck. I hear you want to talk to the owner. Karen spun around with a triumphant expression. Yes, I do. This whole operation is illegal, and I'm going to shut you down. David walked over to her calmly. Okay, I'm listening. What's illegal about it? Karen held up her stack of papers. I researched parking laws online, and according to this website, you can only tow a vehicle if it's parked on private property, or if it's blocking traffic. My RV wasn't doing either of those things. David looked at the papers she was holding. They appeared to be printouts from some kind of legal advice website, with highlighted sections about towing regulations. Karen, can I see those for a second? She handed them over suspiciously. David skimmed through the pages and found the section she had highlighted. It was about commercial parking lots and business districts, not residential areas. Karen, he said, these regulations are for commercial properties. They don't apply to residential driveways. That's what they want you to think, Karen said with the confidence of someone who had just discovered a massive conspiracy. But the law is the law, and according to these regulations, my RV was parked legally. David handed the papers back to her. These are the wrong regulations. You're looking at commercial towing laws, not residential parking ordinances. Karen's face flushed. You're just trying to confuse me. I know my rights. Okay, David said. Let me ask you this. If you're so confident that the tow was illegal, why don't you call the police and file a report? They'll tell you whether or not we had the right to tow your RV. Karen's confidence wavered slightly. I don't need to call the police. I have all the proof I need right here. She waved the papers again. David pulled out his phone. You know what? Let me call them for you. I'm sure they'd be happy to explain the parking laws. No, Karen said quickly. That's not necessary. I just want my RV back, and I want you to pay for the damages. What damages? David asked. Karen gestured vaguely at the impound lot. Emotional distress, illegal seizure of property, I could sue you for thousands of dollars. David looked at Mike, who was trying not to laugh. Karen, you can't sue someone for legally towing your illegally parked vehicle. It wasn't illegally parked, Karen insisted. Yes, David said patiently. It was. It was blocking my driveway, which is a violation of City Ordinance 47B. The same ordinance that Mike showed you yesterday. Karen's face went red. That's harassment. You're targeting me because I'm homeless. I'm targeting you because you keep breaking the law, David said. Your housing situation has nothing to do with it. Karen stared at him for a moment. Then her expression changed from anger to something that looked almost like calculation. You know what, she said, maybe we can work something out. I'll drop the lawsuit if you give me my RV back for free. David blinked. You want me to waive the impound fees? Exactly, Karen said. Consider it a goodwill gesture. You get to avoid a costly legal battle, and I get my home back. David looked at her carefully. Karen, what legal battle? You don't have a case. You admitted to me yesterday that you were living in the RV, which means you were using it as a permanent residence in a residential neighborhood that doesn't allow RV parking. Even if blocking my driveway wasn't illegal, which it is, you'd still be in violation of city housing ordinances. Karen's face went pale. That's not true. Actually, David said, it is. Most residential neighborhoods have strict rules about using RVs as permanent housing. You might want to look into that. Karen clutched her papers tighter. You're just trying to scare me. No, David said. I'm trying to help you understand the situation you're in. You can't just park an RV anywhere you want and live in it. There are rules and regulations that exist for a reason. Karen looked around the impound lot at her RV, sitting behind a chain-link fence. For the first time since David had met her, she looked genuinely defeated. I can't afford the impound fees, she said quietly. I know, David said. That's why I told you yesterday that I'd reduce them if you got the RV out within 2 days. But threatening to sue me isn't exactly helping your case. Karen looked down at her feet. I'm sorry. I just don't know what else to do. David felt that familiar pang of sympathy. Look, the offer still stands. You can get your RV out for just the towing fee if you do it today. But you have to promise me that you won't park it on my street again. Karen looked up at him hopefully. Just the towing fee? How much is that? $300, David said. Karen's face fell. I don't have $300. I told you yesterday I only have $40. David sighed. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Karen, what did you think was going to happen when you parked illegally? Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? I thought you were bluffing, Karen admitted. I thought you were just trying to scare me. Well, David said, I wasn't bluffing, and now you're in a worse position than you were yesterday. Karen stared at her RV through the fence. So what happens now? Do I just lose everything? If you can't pay the impound fees within 30 days, then yes, the RV gets sold at auction to cover the costs. Karen's eyes filled with tears. 30 days? But that's everything I own. David looked at her for a long moment. She was clearly in a desperate situation, but she had also repeatedly ignored his warnings and even tried to manipulate the neighbors against him. He wanted to help, but he also didn't want to reward her bad behavior. Karen, he said finally, I'm going to make you one final offer. I'll let you have your RV back today for just the cost of the tow, which is $300, but you have to sign a legal agreement that you won't park it on residential streets anywhere in the city. If you violate that agreement, I'll have it towed again and you'll pay full impound fees. Karen wiped her eyes. But I told you, I don't have $300. Then you need to figure out how to get it, David said. Call family, friends, take out a loan, sell something, but you have until closing time today to come up with the money. Karen looked desperate. What if I can't? Then the RV stays here and you start accumulating daily storage fees, David said. At $50 a day, you'll owe $800 by the end of the week. Karen stared at him in horror. $800? That's insane. That's business, David said. And that's what happens when you ignore multiple warnings and keep breaking the law. Karen looked around frantically, as if money might materialize out of thin air. There has to be another way. Can't I work off the debt? I could clean your office or answer phones or something. David considered this. Do you have any experience with dispatching or customer service? I was a receptionist for 15 years, Karen said eagerly. I can answer phones, handle paperwork, deal with customers. David looked at Mike, who shrugged. We could use some help with the phones, Mike said, especially on busy days. Okay, David said. Here's what I'll do. You can work off the towing fee at $15 an hour. That's 20 hours of work. But you have to sign the agreement about not parking on residential streets, and if you miss even one day of work, the deal is off. Karen nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. When can I start? Right now, David said. Mike, show her how to answer the phones and handle basic dispatch calls. For the next 3 hours, Karen sat in the office answering phones and taking down information about towing requests. She was actually quite good at it, David had to admit. She was polite with customers, efficient with paperwork, and she seemed to understand the importance of getting accurate information. Around 4 p.m., David went to check on her. How's it going? Good, Karen said. I think I'm getting the hang of it. Your customers are much nicer than the people at the dental office. David smiled. That's because they're calling us for help, not because they're in pain. Karen laughed, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed genuinely relaxed. You know, she said, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually enjoying this job. Well, David said, don't get too comfortable. You still have 17 hours to go. Karen's face fell slightly. Right, just working off the debt. David looked at her for a moment. She had been professional and competent all afternoon, and she seemed to genuinely appreciate having something productive to do. Karen, he said, can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really lose your apartment? Karen's face flushed. I told you I lost my job. But losing your job 3 months ago doesn't mean you'd lose your apartment immediately, David said. Most people have some savings, or they can find temporary work, or they can get assistance. What really happened? Karen was quiet for a long moment. I got behind on rent when I lost my job, she said finally, and instead of asking for help or trying to work something out with my landlord, I just hid from the problem. I stopped answering his calls, stopped checking my mail, stopped dealing with reality. By the time I finally faced up to what was happening, I owed 3 months' rent, and he'd already filed for eviction. David nodded. So you bought the RV as a quick fix? I thought it would give me time to figure things out, Karen said. But then I couldn't find work, and I couldn't afford RV parks, and I just kept making worse and worse decisions. Like parking on my street. Karen winced. Like parking on your street. I knew it was wrong, but I was so desperate and scared that I convinced myself I didn't have any other choice. David looked at her carefully. Karen, you always have choices. They might not be good choices, but you always have them. The problem is that you keep choosing the easy solution instead of the right solution. Karen was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said. I know you're right. I just don't know how to fix it. Well, David said, you're already starting to fix it. You're working, you're taking responsibility, and you're being honest about your mistakes. That's a good start. Karen looked up at him hopefully. Does that mean I might be able to keep working here after I pay off the debt? David considered this. We'll see. You'd have to prove that you can be reliable and that you're serious about turning your life around. But if you can do that, then maybe we can work something out. Karen smiled for the first time since he'd met her. Thank you, she said, for everything. I know I've been awful to you, and I know I don't deserve your help. Everyone deserves a second chance, David said. The trick is not wasting it. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen worked at the towing company every day, gradually paying off her debt and learning the business. She was punctual, professional, and surprisingly good at dealing with upset customers. She had a way of calming people down and explaining situations that even David found impressive. More importantly, she found a legal place to park her RV at a campground about 20 minutes outside the city. It cost her $40 a night, but she was earning enough from her work to afford it, and she was starting to save money for a more permanent solution. You know, Mike said to David one afternoon, she's actually turned out to be pretty good at this job. David nodded. Yeah, I'm impressed. I wasn't sure she had it in her. Think you'll keep her on permanently? David looked through the office window at Karen, who was patiently explaining to a customer why their car had been towed and what they needed to do to get it back. I think so, he said. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. 3 months later, David was working in his garage when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He looked up to see Karen walking across the street with a plate of cookies in her hands. Hi, David, she said. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for me. David wiped his hands on a rag. How are things going? Really well, Karen said. I saved up enough money to put a deposit on a small apartment, and I'm moving in next week. I wanted to give you these cookies as a thank you gift. David accepted the plate with a smile. Are they gluten-free? Karen laughed. I remembered. And David? I also wanted to apologize again for how I acted when we first met. I was desperate and scared, but that's no excuse for the way I treated you. We all make mistakes, David said. The important thing is that we learn from them. Karen nodded. I definitely learnt from mine. I also learnt that sometimes the person you think is your enemy is actually trying to help you. David looked across the street at his driveway, which had remained completely clear of RVs for the past 3 months. Well, he said, I'm glad everything worked out. Me too, Karen said. And David, if you ever need a reference for what a good boss looks like, you can use me. David smiled. I'll keep that in mind. As Karen walked back to her apartment, David sat on his porch and enjoyed one of the cookies. It was, he had to admit, actually quite good. He looked at his clear driveway, thought about the past few months, and realized that sometimes the best victories weren't about winning fights, but about turning enemies into allies. The next morning, David woke up, looked out his window, and saw his driveway completely clear, just as it had been every morning for the past 3 months. He smiled, made his coffee, and headed to work where Karen was already at her desk, answering phones and helping customers with the same professionalism she'd shown every day since she'd started working there. And as he backed out of his driveway without any obstacles, David reflected on the fact that sometimes the most satisfying endings weren't about crushing your enemies, but about helping them become better people. Though he had to admit, knowing that he owned the Impound lot where Karen's RV had been towed certainly hadn't hurt his negotiating position. In the end, David had won, but more importantly, so had Karen. And that, he decided, was the kind of victory worth having.